just want to say hi. I'm Travis. I'm so excited that you all are here today because we have a really cool webinar that we're going to walk through with you with one of my new friends, Dr. Jeffrey Tarrant. And I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Tarrant through, well, indirectly through another psychic medium, Laura Lynn Jackson, who is super fabulous. She was doing an Instagram live, and Dr. Tarrant was on the Instagram live with her. And they were talking about mediumship and how it works in the brain and what's happening in the brain while mediumship is going on. And I was so fascinated because, I've been a medium my whole life, but doing it professionally for about 5 years. And I love knowing why things work. And I've always been curious about those things. And so I immediately reached out to Dr. Tarrant and was like, hey, I want to come down and have you scan my brain. And we set up some time to chat and to meet, and here we are today to kind of go over the work that we did last month. But I want to give Dr. Tarrant just a moment to introduce himself and share with you all the work that he does and how he serves in this world. So Dr. Tarrant, take it away.
Okay. Well, first off, thanks for, inviting me and setting this up. It's super fun. And just by way of my background, just so people have a sense, my background's actually as a psychologist. So I'm a counseling psychologist. But very early in my career got involved with doing neurofeedback and other kinds of neurostimulation techniques. And at that point, it was really all designed for mental wellness, tied in with my work as a psychologist. But over the last 12 years, I've really gotten more involved with looking at the brains of mediums and psychics and healers and channelers and spirit artists and, all of the interesting psi stuff, psychokinesis. There's a few things I still haven't looked at, but they're on my to-do list. Telepathy, of course, more recently I've been involved in the telepathy tapes. People might be familiar with that. And so, a lot of the work I've been doing has been using the EEG technology as a way to look at the brain and say, well, what's going on when people are doing these, whatever their gifts are, whatever their skills are? And how is that different than when they're just having a regular conversation or they're just at baseline? And really, for me, the goal is goal. I mean, part of it's just very interesting, but if there's a goal at this point for me, it's understanding, like, are there certain patterns that come up repeatedly? And if we can understand that, is there a way to sort of reverse engineer this so that we can help people shift their own brains in a way that might facilitate them tapping into their own abilities?
I love that so much. And I'm so fascinated with just the work that you do and the way that you show up and share it with the world. And so just to give kind of everyone an idea of what we're doing today. So I went down to Dr. Tarrant's office in Eugene, Oregon. And I got to spend a whole day with him. I feel so lucky. In case you can't tell from the video, he is this like chill and calm presence in person, which is so funny because I'm like, "Ah," So it was so awesome to go down and just have the experience. And I didn't know what to expect. I had an idea of what we were going to do. You did such a good job of kind of prepping me and telling me how we were going to kind of walk through the day. So, just to give everyone an idea of what I did, when I showed up, Dr. Tarrant and I we had a conversation of kind of what I was hoping to see, which was, that I'm not making this up in my head, that something is actually happening while I'm giving readings, but also, to see kind of like what is really going on inside of my brain. And so, we did a couple of things. We After Dr. Tarrant put the EEG on me, we did a 3 minute like baseline with my eyes closed, and then 3 minutes of me just talking, which I chose to talk about the White Lotus for 3 minutes with no spoilers. And then I gave two different readings, which we're going to talk about the differences in what Dr. Tarrant did put on my brain during the readings. But it was so cool to sit through and just to be a part of because, I really feel like there is so much that material science hasn't quite been able to prove yet, but I feel like they're getting there. And I feel like work like this just, I don't know, it makes me feel good to know that there are people like you out there in the world who believe in this. And so should we dive in and show them what we did and what you saw?
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do it. And then you can explain the testing that you did way more eloquently than I can. Listen, I was a 1.6 GPA in high school. I failed science, so you can explain it way better than I can.
Okay. Well, but when I get going on this, I hope you'll jump in too if you have,
Yes.
comments or things, related to your
Oh, I'll
experience
jump in
or
with commentary. And listen, we are going to allow for Q&A. So at the end, we'll take questions. So you guys can type your questions in the chat at the end, not right now. But just save your questions, write them down, and then we'll definitely have time for Q&A for everyone.
great. So I'll go ahead and share my screen because I've got sort of a PowerPoint here. It's easier to kind of walk through some of this data. Uh, is this showing up correctly? Just the one slide?
Can someone pop in the chat if it's showing up for them, that if you can see what's on the screen? Awesome. Cool. We're
And,
good. We
and
got a whole bunch of yeses.
okay,
Amazing.
great, fantastic. So obviously this first slide is, a picture from that day. And, I told Travis at the beginning, it's a good look for him. This is the EEG cap. And so just as an orientation to kind of what, the type of technique we were using, this is it's called an electro cap. And there's 19 electrodes built into that kind of a swim cap, kind of a headset. And essentially, what that allows us to do is measure 19 areas of the brain simultaneously. So we can get a lot of information, a lot of data when we're recording brainwave activity. And so, this is what Travis was stuck wearing for, a few hours anyway. Uh,
Is
and
is there sorry to interrupt you. Is there a way to make it just the one slide because they can see both right now?
Oh, yeah, that's what I was trying to figure out because I thought it was. I'm glad somebody said something
Yeah.
because I've got dual screens here. And so, how's that? Are we in business now?
Nope, still two slides.
Really? Let me try something else real quick.
But so yeah, the cap was not uncomfortable, but I thought I was going to be giving Dr. Tarrant an advantage for being bald, but apparently that was not the case. Um it was that was not the case. It was more so I think you said a little bit difficult to stick it to head that doesn't have hair.
It's not that it's difficult to stick it on uh, a head with no hair, but it's actually harder to get a good reading,
Okay.
uh, and which seems counterintuitive because you would think it would make it easier to get a clean reading. But what happens is that the skin gets kind of tough when you don't have as much hair. And our slides look okay now.
Yeah, we're in great shape now.
Okay.
Our wonderful participants are letting us know. And so it's good. We are good to go. Thank you everyone so much. I appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks, guys. But so yeah, it's actually because if you think about it, you're measuring teeny tiny amounts of electricity that are coming from the brain, but you
Mhm.
have to read it through the skull and through the skin and through the hair. So you're measuring these teeny tiny, you know, electrical signals, but there's things getting in the way. And so what happens is when you don't have as much hair, the skin gets tough and it actually creates more of a
Mhm.
barrier to reading the signal. But we had no problem. We got good signals without too much trouble. Uh, Luckily Travis has a conducive brain or something. So where I thought we might start is before we just dive straight into the brainwave analysis. I thought I would take just a couple of slides to explain what the heck brainwaves are
Mhm.
and kind of how they work, just so that everybody that's watching this, if you're not familiar with brainwaves, that you've got sort of an orientation, so that when we get into more of the details, it makes more sense. So bear with me. If you know stuff about brainwaves, just hang in there for a minute. It's just a couple of slides.
I need the
Uh,
refresher anyway. I forget.
yeah. Well, I mean, I think most people can probably appreciate just having a little bit of a different perspective on what brainwaves are and how they work. Um, so the short story is that, all of the neurons in your brain, all of the brain cells, communicate electrically and chemically. And we're all pretty used to the chemical part, because we hear about things like serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine and these chemicals in the brain, which is part of how they communicate with each other, is by sending these chemicals around. But the other part of the process is electrical. And so what happens is, you if you look at this kind of model of brain cells, so here's one brain cell up here, if you can see my cursor, uh, and it's receiving the chemical signals from this other neuron, right? There's a neuron over here that we can't see. It's sending chemical signals. It gets picked up in the cell body of the neuron. And when it receives enough of that signal, then it sends an electrical current down to the end of the axon. This is the axon where the electrical signal travels. And then at the end of this, there are these little kind of bubbles at the end, which are filled with chemicals. And so when the signal gets down there, it releases more chemicals, and then that goes and communicates to other cells. So really the communication in the brain involves both electrical and chemical. And so we're just going to be dealing with the electrical aspect of this, because what happens is, you've got whatever, a bazillion brain cells that are all firing thousands of times a second. And so what that does is it literally creates an electrical field in your brain. And that electrical field moves throughout the brain and then can be recorded on the surface. And so the work that we do is measuring that electrical activity. And so it's called an electroencephalograph, or EEG. So that's literally what we're doing. We're putting electrodes on the scalp and we're picking up these electrical pulses that the brain is generating. Now, we got to break it down a little bit because there's some elements of this that deserve a little bit of explanation. So this is kind of what it looks like when we're doing a recording. So, when we were recording Travis's brainwaves, it looked something like this. So there's 19 lines that show up on the screen. And this is called the raw EEG because it hasn't been filtered. There's been nothing that's happened to it. And this is kind of what, you see on TV shows and things like that. Or if you've ever gone to have an evaluation for a seizure or for a head injury or something like that, the neurologist is looking at this kind of activity. And that's fine if you're looking for gross abnormalities, right? So if you're looking for big problems, you'll see it in this type of data. For us, we're looking for things that are a little more subtle. And so this is not going to be enough. And the reason is because each one of these little lines, right? There's 19 of them because there's 19 electrodes. Each one of these lines actually contains a lot of information that you might miss if you don't run it through some specialized filters to sort of break it down. And what I mean by that is you can kind of use the analogy of white light. This is the analogy I use all the time to explain how brainwaves work. By the way, any Pink Floyd fans out there? Just checking.
Really
Uh,
quick, Dr. Tarrant. I have one person saying they can't see the slides. Neil is saying he can't see the slides. Can anybody else see the slides? Okay, so other people can see them. Okay. Uh, Neil, maybe adjust your settings and check, but everybody else can see them. So we'll keep going. And Neil, if you can't see them, um, the recording will have them as well. So you're welcome to watch back, Neil. We'll make sure that you have access to the recording, then they'll be on there. Okay, go ahead, Dr. Tarrant. Thank you so
yeah,
much.
Neil, it might be your view that you have set on your Zoom. So you might check your view and see if there's a different view setting that you can select that might allow you to see it. Um, so anyway, kind of what I was getting ready to say was that we can use the analogy of white light as a way to understand brain waves. So if you think about a beam of white light, it's a beam of white light. But then when you take it and you throw it through a prism or you throw it through a raindrop or something like that, on the other side, you get a rainbow. And so you see all the different colors of the visible light spectrum. And so what we can kind of learn from that is that white light actually contains all of the frequencies, right? Because red is a different frequency than orange. Orange is a different frequency than yellow, which is why we perceive them as different colors, is because they're different frequencies. So white light contains all of that. And so when we go back to the brain waves, each one of these little squiggly lines actually is kind of like white light. So there's a whole bunch of frequencies contained within here. But just like white light, you don't see it unless you filter it.
Mm.
So what we do is we use a digital filter. So we take this data and then we run it through a digital filter, and then it separates all of those different frequencies. So literally we can see something that's kind of analogous to the colors of brain waves. But instead of calling the brain waves red, orange, yellow, whatever, we call them delta, theta, alpha, beta. So the kinds of frequencies that people have probably heard of, right? That these kind of ideas of like, oh, alpha brain waves, yeah, they do this and that. So literally that's what we're doing is we're breaking the brain waves signal apart so that we can see something that's more like this. So it's just kind of a separation of these different categories. And this I like this slide because it's got the little animation, but but the uh, one thing that's important to understand is that the brain is making all these frequencies all the time, everywhere, and it includes very slow frequencies, things like delta. So for delta, there's going to be less repetitions in a second of time. That's how we determine how fast a brainwave is, how many repetitions there are within 1 second. And so for delta, there's going to be fewer. There's going to be between 0 and 4 repetitions per second, which we talk about in terms of hertz. That's how we talk about electricity. And so slow brain waves are delta, and then we're kind of moving up into faster brain waves. And you can see by the categorizations on this slide. So 4 to 8 hertz is a little faster, that's theta. 8 to 12 hertz, a little faster, that's alpha, etc. So this slide actually does give it colors, which is kind of nice, right? It's a little bit like that rainbow idea. And this is where things start to get interesting, because even though we have all of these brain waves everywhere all the time, they vary in how much there is, right? So sometimes we have a lot of one particular brain wave and maybe not as much of another. And when things like that shift, that is directly related to our states of consciousness. And so that's where we start to get interested. And that's where some of the oversimplified descriptions of brainwaves come in, right? People say like, oh, delta means this, alpha means this. It's like, well, yes, it's usually more complicated, but we'll start at that really sort of simplified level. So for example, if you have a lot of delta, remember that's the really slow brainwave, you're probably unconscious because it's such a slow brainwave. So if you have a lot of delta, you're probably in deep sleep. Or it could even be something like a healing state. So you'll see that sometimes when there's a brain injury, that there's a lot of delta because it's damaged. So everything like slows down and kind of it's like shut down for repair, right? You can also see it sometimes when people have some level of, dissociation, whether it's healthy dissociation or not healthy, right? Like the brain, like certain parts of the brain are kind of turning off. So theta, we're moving up a little bit. That can be starting to fall asleep, but it's also involved in things like memory, the subconscious, intuition, things like this, right? It's a deeper state of consciousness, theta. Theta is very interesting. And actually, we'll be talking about theta more in a moment when we talk about Travis's brain. Uh, and then we go up to alpha. Alpha's kind of in the middle. And it's associated with more of a relaxed, internal, resting state of consciousness. So on this chart, it's got visualization and creativity. True, those are often also associated with theta. So there's a little bit of a blend sometimes between alpha and theta in terms of some of their functionality. But then we get into the fast brain waves. So we can kind of think of alpha, theta, and delta as being slow, and beta and gamma as being fast. So when there's a lot of beta activity, we're generally more alert, we're more focused, we're cognitively engaged in something. So we're thinking or planning or organizing or whatever, right? The stuff that we think of the brain doing is a lot of beta activity. And then we get to gamma. Gamma is also very interesting. This is the fastest brainwave that we can measure effectively with the kind of technology that we're using. And so gamma is very fast. So, of course, it's associated with activity, but it's also associated with things like inspiration or high level understanding, but without effort. So, whereas beta might be like you have to work to understand something or to think about something, gamma is kind of like you just get it. So, it's like being in a flow state or being in the zone where you're just performing at a high level, but you don't have to really work for it. So gamma is pretty interesting as well. And a lot of people, of course, he's like, how do I get into a gamma state? Right? Because, it's more of that being in a flow. So again, we have all of these all the time. The issue is just where are they happening
Mhm.
and how much are they happening in relation to each other? Hopefully that makes sense. So let's get to Travis's brain. Now that you all are experts on EEG, let's talk about what was going on with Travis. So the first thing that we did was, he mentioned that we did a 3 minute eyes closed baseline. So he wasn't doing anything at that point. He was just sitting and hanging out for 3 minutes. And so what we did was we took that data and then compared it to a normative database. So we have a database of a bunch of other people out there in the world. So we can kind of get a sense of like, well, what's kind of average, based on your age and some other things like that.
Mhm.
So that's what this map is doing is it's essentially saying, well, how does Travis's brain just at baseline compare to the average brain for somebody that's about the same age? And the way that you can read this chart is if you look at the little key at the bottom, you can see the rainbow of colors and anything that's in the middle of this key. So at 0, which is green, color coded green, basically says, yeah, the amount of activity in Travis's brain was about average. It was about the same that we would expect. So anywhere you see green, it's like, yeah, that's about what we would expect. It's about, kind of average. Not that your brain is average, but your activity was average. And then when you start seeing brighter colors, right? So yellow, orange, moving up into red, that means there's significantly more activity than the database. And then when you start seeing cooler colors, right? So getting into light blues and then deeper blues, there's significantly less activity compared to that database. So the first thing that we wanted to do is just say, well, what's going on with your brain when you're just hanging out? And so this is kind of like the 10,000 foot view, right? Of kind of like, well, what's just happening? And so if we look at this first line, so again, we're starting at delta, delta, theta, alpha, beta, high beta. So this particular system doesn't have gamma in this type of analysis, but high beta is basically right next to gamma. So they're very similar in many ways. And what you can see is there's a lot of green. It's mostly green. However, we have this really interesting thing here, this giant hot spot of theta, kind of right in the middle of the head. And so theta, I already mentioned, is very interesting. And it's interesting for several reasons, but my background is as a psychologist. And so, if people come in and they're coming in for some concern, and I see a lot of theta, the first thing I would wonder about is if this person has ADHD, just because that's the stereotypical ADHD pattern, right? And so I'm not diagnosing Travis here.
Oh,
Uh,
no, spoiler alert. Anybody that knows me knows like where this is coming from. So totally. Really quick, we had a question in the chat really fast. Before we move forward, will you just really quickly let them know what the top row means and what the bottom row means, the absolute power row and the relative power mode?
yeah, yeah, and it's a good question. So these little head maps, right? So each little head map, you can see there's the nose, there's the ears. The little white dots represent where the electrodes are on the cap. And the first row is absolute power. And so it's basically just saying how much power. So if you look at each electrode, so in this case, alpha, let's just go to the center. So if we're looking at the very center of the head at alpha, how much alpha is your brain generating compared to average? So absolute power is just looking at how much there is. And saying, like, well, how does that compare?
Mhm.
Now, the bottom row, relative power, is a little bit different because it's more like looking at a distribution. So it's saying like, okay, how much ever power you're generating, we don't care. But how is that energy, how much ever energy you have in your brain, how is it distributed among all the brain waves and among all the locations? So we can put numbers to that too. So it's like a percentage almost, right? So you got X percentage of theta in a certain location and X percentage of alpha. So then we can compare that to the database as well. Um, and so when you look at that, right, and that's why I put that on the slide, is
Yeah.
because you see that, you still have an excessive amount of theta there, but then you get these blue sections in beta and high beta. So it basically is saying you don't have as much fast activity, right? The fast activity is kind of getting sucked down into theta land uh, because it's a distribution, right? So if you've got too much of brain activity in one area, well, it's got to come from somewhere. So
Hmm.
it's basically taking it from the beta and the high beta, right? It's kind of like pulling the energy from there. And again, kind of a stereotypical ADHD pattern. Um,
Yeah.
uh, again, Travis can diagnose himself. I'm not diagnosing him.
Oh,
Uh,
listen, from your lips to my therapist's ears.
and so what's interesting about this is there's a couple of things, right? Because first off, that may be seem contradictory to a lot of people. It's like, well, wait a minute. Don't people with ADHD, they move too fast? Like, why would they have too many slow brain waves? Right? And it's like, well, if you have too many slow brain waves, in this case theta, what happens is those areas of the brain aren't able to do their job as efficiently as we would like. And so if it's controlling things like paying attention or things like inhibiting your impulses, right? The brain may not be as efficient at getting that job done, which is why, by the way, that at least certain individuals with ADHD respond really well to stimulants, right? Because you're counterbalancing this excess slow activity by sort of speeding the brain up a little bit. Um, so, anyway, the other part that's interesting is we see this pattern a decent amount with psychic mediums. And, I've said this before, but I suspect there's a higher percentage of psychic mediums with ADHD than the general population. Uh, and one reason that that may be relevant is because of kind of what I was just saying that if you have a lot of theta, it's like the brain is disinhibited. It's not as skilled at inhibiting information flow. And that actually might work to your advantage. So you may already be predisposed to, because the way your brain works, to being able to take in information that otherwise might get filtered out, right? It's like the brain's more open. Uh, the other thing that's cool about theta is the dominant brainwave of young kids. And if you think about young kids for a minute, they tend to be very psychic and
Mhm.
very tapped in. They see ghosts, they know things, they're connected to nature. Uh, and part of that is that theta, is that, they're in that brainwave frequency. And then as we get older, the brain kind of speeds up and pulls us out of that, right? And we see that with little kids. They can be super tapped in, and then by the time they hit the age of 8 or something, they kind of lose it. They don't they're not talking about seeing ghosts anymore and whatever, right? It's like their brain has kind of moved out of a more receptive, open pattern. Um, One more factoid about theta: this is also the frequency that we live in. So there's an electromagnetic field between the Earth and the ionosphere. It's called the Schumann resonance. And the dominant frequency of the Schumann resonance is 7.83 hertz, which is theta. That's in the theta range. So this is also like, the frequency of nature, like literally. Um, so there may be something to that too, right? Of just being kind of more connected to our more natural frequency, that we're not sort of pulled out into something that's, incongruent with how we are. So I just have one more slide that is kind of the same thing, but I just wanted to break it down a little bit more. So we can look at the frequencies instead of just looking at delta, theta, alpha, beta. We can break it down into single hertz increments. So here it's 1 hertz, 2 hertz, 3 hertz, 4 hertz, 5 hertz. So it's kind of like taking that rainbow and then looking at all the shades of the colors, right? So it's not just red, yellow, orange, but there's different variations of those colors. And what's interesting here, right, is you see that 7 and 8 hertz, right there at that Schumann resonance, right? Remember what I just said, 7.83. Well, that's going to be in between 7 and 8. And look at that 7 and 8. I mean, they're just lit up like a Christmas tree.
Wow.
Yeah, kind of cool, right?
And you said you do a lot of EEGs and testing for folks who are part of the Forever Family Foundation, which if you aren't familiar with the Forever Family Foundation, it's a great organization. It's a nonprofit organization that helps people navigate grief, but there's also a lot of psychics and mediums who are they don't like the term certified, but I'm going to use the term certified because I can't think of the other term that they use. But essentially, they vet mediums. Not as a certification, and I know that's not the right word, but they vet mediums and they put them through a rigorous testing process. And in turn, Dr. Tarrant has done some EEGs on some of those folks. And you had shared with me, you find that a lot of them have this similar frequency that their brain emits. Is that the correct verbiage that I could use for this?
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, the very first medium that I ever tested, Janet Mayer,
Hmm.
and some folks may be familiar with her. She's got some other interesting gifts as well. But her brainwave pattern at baseline looks very similar, right? There's a ton of theta kind of cruising around, centrally and a little bit frontally. And so, the very first person, the very first medium I ever looked at, kind of had that same pattern.
That's so cool to know that there is like that you see that in other people, right? I know all of our brains are different and everybody's abilities are totally different. So my EEG may not look like Laura Lynn Jackson's or someone else's, but it is cool to see some of those commonalities.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. It's a really good point because, even though, having mapped quite a number of psychics and mediums at this point, there are some overlaps. There are some things that tend to show up, and there's also a lot of differences between individuals. And so I think that's important to recognize, right? Is like you don't have to have a specific brainwave pattern in order to tap in. It may mean you have to tap in a little bit differently. You may have to shift your brain in a different way. But as far as I can tell, there's a number of paths, right? It's kind of like when we talk about spiritual practices
Yeah.
and all the different practices end up at the same place, right? It's just a different path. And so I think this is similar, right? There's a lot of different brain patterns, but they all might end up in a similar place. Okay, the other thing that I did just for fun, because it's part of the analysis system that I have, it's got this ability to predict based on brainwave patterns if somebody has a traumatic brain injury. And again, Travis didn't tell me he's got a brain injury, but I just did it kind of out of curiosity because, again, I've seen with so many. In fact, I think every single Forever Family Foundation medium I've tested
Hmm.
triggered this index. Uh, you know, Maybe there was one exception, but um, and so you can see, it put you at a 90% likelihood of having a traumatic brain injury, and it puts you in kind of the moderate range of that based on these EEG metrics. And, again, I'm not necessarily saying you have a head injury, but what that tells us is that there's enough differences in the way that your brain behaves compared to kind of average that the system is kind of like, okay, something's different here, right? And so, you triggered this index. And again, we see this a lot. So it makes me think there maybe is something to this as well, right? Um, and I don't know if have you ever had a head injury?
To
I'm
my
sure we talked about
knowledge,
this.
no, and I like triple checked with my mom too. Like to my knowledge, no traumatic brain injury that would you know, that would trigger something like this. I asked my mom, I'm like, Mom, what did you do to me as a child? And she laughed. I was like, Did you drop me? Um, but no, nothing to my knowledge that that would constitute a brain injury.
Yeah. And that's true with actually most of the mediums that I've talked to. Most of them say something similar. It's kind of like, I don't think so. Nothing unusual that,
Yeah.
So again, like there's something about just the way that mediums' brains seem to be operating that it's different enough that it's triggering something here. Okay, let's get to the star of the show here. Um, so the once we got past the baseline recordings, then the next thing that we did was, and Travis kind of mentioned this, but just to reiterate, we did another baseline, just having him talk about, in this case, White Lotus. And yes, thank God he didn't spoil it for me because I was still in the middle of whatever season I was on. Uh, so I finished it now, so it's safe. But so we just got a baseline of him talking, and the reason that we wanted to do that is because when he was going to do the mediumship readings, obviously he's also going to be talking, right? It's hard to give a reading if you're not communicating to the person the information you're getting. And so what that means is that, well, we need to compare apples to apples. So if you're talking in one recording, we need to be talking in the other recording. And then looking at, well, what's the difference? What's the difference between having a regular conversation and giving a reading? So we did the White Lotus recording, and then we did a mediumship reading. And Travis had arranged for a couple of different individuals that he had never done readings for before. I think, is that correct?
Correct.
To call in on Zoom because we were at my office. So we did a Zoom call with them, and Travis did a reading for them while we recorded his brainwave activity. So this is the first mediumship reading. Remember, there was two. And
Yep.
so essentially what we did was we compared the mediumship reading data to the White Lotus data. And so what you're seeing on this screen is the differences. So what's the difference between those two conditions? And again, you can think about the color coding in a similar way to the other imaging that we were looking at before. So if there's green, that means there wasn't really much difference between the two recordings. So White Lotus was about the same as mediumship. So anytime you see green, it's like, yeah, it was about the same. Now, when you start seeing brighter colors, and that's where this analysis system's a little bit different because it goes yellow, orange, red, and then it goes to this kind of gray color. It's supposed to be white, but the way it shows up when it's overlaid on this 3D head, it looks kind of gray. So gray is actually more than white or more than red. Sorry. So that's the one difference. So there's an increase of activity anytime you see those brighter colors or the gray. When you see blue, there was a decrease of activity during the mediumship reading. So what we're seeing, first off, when we just take a quick glance at this, you can see that there are some significant differences, right? There's some areas that are green, and it's like, okay, but there's also a lot of things that changed significantly. And so I want to talk through a few of these and what they might mean and why I think they're interesting. So the first thing is you see a pretty dramatic increase of delta. And remember, delta is the slowest brain wave. Remember, I was associating it with deep sleep.
Yeah.
And, obviously you were not asleep when you were doing the mediumship reading. Um, but, but yet there's all this slow activity. And, and in fact, we see it with theta too. So even though you already had a decent amount of theta, it increased even more, and especially in this right frontal region. So there's a couple of things to say about this. So the first is when there's an increase of slow activity, it can mean a couple of things, right? It can mean that those areas of the brain are kind of shutting down, kind of like we talked about, right? Like when you're asleep or when you're have an injury, that things kind of go offline. And I think that's actually what happens a lot of times with mediumship and psychic readings is that people have to get the brain out of the way, right? And mediums tell me this all the time, right? It's like you got to put your ego aside, you got to put yourself aside. And I think one way to do that is to quiet down the brain. And you can quiet down the brain by adding more slow brain waves, right? The other thing about slow brain waves is that they tend to be connected to these deeper states of consciousness, right? Like the subconscious and sort of, where all that juicy stuff is in there, like way down when you get into a really, really, really deep meditation, right? You get into these slow brain waves. So that's pretty interesting all by itself. I want to go over to theta though, because the location of some of these are pretty interesting. So I mentioned that this one is really hanging out in that right frontal region. And this is another region that shows up a lot when I look at psychics and mediums, the right frontal. But depending on the person, sometimes slow stuff increases, sometimes fast stuff increases, sometimes it decreases. This is one of those individual differences, but it's almost always in the right frontal lobe. And one of the things that's important about the right frontal lobe, or one of the functions, is how we're paying attention. That's a lot of what the right frontal lobe is doing. It's like sustaining attention. So if you've got a lot of slow activity up there, delta and theta in this case, it suggests more of an open attention. So rather than being like laser focused on something, it's more like opening wide, your attention so that you can just take in whatever's present. So it's a very different way of paying attention. And I don't know if that fits with your experience or what it's like for you when you're doing a mediumship reading.
Yeah, it's so funny though, because like when I'm giving a mediumship reading, I feel like everything is moving so fast. Like that's why it's so funny to hear that like everything in my brain is slowing down because I can feel like my heart rate increasing. I start to sweat. I start to like feel like, and I think I even said this to you. It's like when I'm giving readings, sometimes I have to like, I feel like I just need to get the information out, which I know a lot of other mediums work the same way, where it's like you're in that flow of channeling. It's like, I just need to say this. Which so it's interesting to see that like my brain is slowing down, but I feel like I'm moving really fast through it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, right? Because we could use kind of that ADHD idea as a little bit of an analogy, right? Because so, even though there's a lot of slow brain waves, uh, you know, you may be feeling like you're moving fast or there's a lot going on, right?
Yeah.
And it's because the filters are off. So if you take the filters off of your brain,
Mhm.
it can allow a flood of information to come in. So,
Mm.
essentially what you're doing is normally the way the brain works is it limits information. That's one of the brain's main jobs is to limit how much stuff comes in.
Yeah. That makes so much sense. That makes so much sense. And I truthfully didn't think about my ADHD as a gift until we met. I want you to know that. Like for the longest time, I'm like, God, why isn't like my brain different? And it wasn't until this where I was like, oh, my brain is supposed to be that way. Thanks. So I did get that out of it. But yeah, it's so interesting. And I'm hoping, I feel like there might be some people that are also kind of resonating with some of this information, at least how they feel. So that's great. Good.
Yeah. And so just a couple more things on here because there were so many good interesting things with your brain map. And I know I told you that it's like, wow, this is like you've got like all of the stuff. Like, when I look at the brains of mediums, it's like, oh, there might be this one thing or this other thing, and you've kind of got them all. You've got the smorgasbord.
The perfectionist part of me that's healing wants you to know that that is very validating. So
How about this? You're the best. Travis, you're the best medium I've ever measured.
Oh, listen. We don't have to go that far, but I appreciate this. You know why? Because I think, and I don't know, maybe other folks that are listening will understand this or connect with this, is there is a part of me, not so much anymore, but when I first started, I was like, am I making this up? Like, am I making this up? Am I batshit crazy? What's going on with me? And so there is the part of me that does appreciate material science, that does appreciate these things because I think it just validates not just for me, but for other mediums. Like this is very real, and there's a very real thing that's happening inside of our beautifully designed bodies. And so I think it's very validating to see.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in case it wasn't clear, yes, I love you. You're wonderful. And I love all of my other mediums too. I was just
Yes.
being playful.
And
Yeah.
and
So,
so we're clear, I'm the best. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. But
um,
enough about me. What do you think about me? No, I'm kidding. Let's keep going. I
yeah.
could, oh Lord, someone come
Okay.
put me away.
So the other thing I wanted to bring up about the theta is you also see this kind of hot spot of theta right here in this kind of right rear quadrant.
Mhm.
And that's another one of those like almost kind of trademark things that we see. And in fact, what's interesting is so you see this extra theta here. And if when we start getting into the fast brain waves, look, in the same region, you start seeing blue
Mhm.
showing up. So again, there's an increase of slow activity, but a decrease of fast activity in this basically the same location.
And that's called the God spot, correct?
This is the God spot.
What does that mean?
What does that mean? So the God spot, and a lot of researchers would not be happy with me using that term, right? They don't like that term because it implies that there's one area in the brain that's associated with whatever, spirituality, which is not true. I use that term because it's kind of what the media had dubbed this spot when researchers discovered it. And, it kind of stuck. But the reason that it got that name is because what they found is that this part of the brain, this right rear quadrant, is associated with boundaries between self and others.
Mm,
So when it's doing its normal job, when it's working the way it's supposed to work, it creates separation. So it's like, I'm Jeff, I live in this meat suit. You're Travis, you live in that meat suit. We're separate, we're different, we're not connected. Like that's what that part of the brain establishes. But what you see a lot of times with mediums and with you see it with you as well is that they kind of change the way that that part of the brain is engaged. And usually what they end up doing is kind of turning that part of the brain off temporarily. And I think what that does is it allows a connection outside of yourself so that you're not limited to your small self anymore, that you can expand outside of that to connect to something bigger. And so, in that research with the God spot, what they found is that people that had injuries to that part of the brain, so that part of the brain wasn't doing its normal job, they became more empathic
mm.
and they reported having more spiritual experiences, like, connecting to energies outside of themselves or talking to deceased relatives or whatever,
Yeah.
became more common.
Yeah. When I'm so interesting, and again, seeing this is all very validating because when I'm channeling or I'm connected to the departed, especially, I do feel it more like back here. And I've always said that, like, I do feel like it kind of comes in from like not quite behind me, but like off to the side of my right is where I feel that. And when I'm seeing or perceiving, and sometimes if you watch me read, like you'll see my hands or you'll see me look, I actually go off to like the front right side is where I receive, or you'll see me turn my head that way. Or so it's interesting because I didn't, I again, 1.6 GPA, didn't know how the brain works going into this, none of this. And so as you're sharing this with me, spoiler alert, I've seen this before. I've seen this already. But when you were sharing these results with me when we were doing this one-on-one, it like really resonated because it's like, oh my gosh, like I was never told to look this way. I wasn't trained. Like that's just how I feel and how I perceive. And so it's so cool to see something that again validates my own experience when I'm reading or when I'm connecting.
Yeah. And, and for me, that's the part that's really fun too, right? Is that it's like, can we understand kind of what's going on here and how somebody like you is able to do this,
Mhm.
right? And so clearly you got to kind of like shift your brain in a way that's different than your sort of normal waking consciousness. Um, and, at least my personal feeling, and you have to tell me what you think about this, is that, everybody has the potential to connect to the other side. But for some people, it may just be a little bit easier just because of the way their brain's wired or whatever. They may just have a little easier time kind of getting that job done. Um,
Yeah. I compare it to singing. Technically, everyone can. Not everyone should do it professionally, but everyone can sing, right? We can sing for our own enjoyment in the car, whatever. Or like sports. Like I am not naturally inclined to sports, but there are some people who they just pick up a ball and they can, they do really well. I don't think I'm with you. I think this is an ability. I think that what people can receive from it is the gift. I don't think I'm the gift. I think I'm just sharing something. But no, I'm with you. I do think that this is something that we all have. but it's different. It doesn't look the same for everybody. And I think that's what we think, right? Just because somebody plays, if anybody likes sports, I don't know why I'm using a sports analogy, but just because somebody plays football doesn't mean they play every position well, right? Or like there's different types of psychologists or different types of doctors. I think sometimes we lump everyone into the same kind of pile and it has to look the same and be the same. And it's not, it's different.
Yeah, I think that's really important. You know, a lot of the different folks that I've worked with, it's clear that different people have different skill sets,
Yeah.
things that they're really good at. And even in the psi world, right? You know, like some people are really good energy healers, but they don't really claim to have any psychic abilities or anything else. Or
Hmm.
some people are really good at like psychokinesis, moving things with their mind. But again, you know, they don't talk to spirits, right? So it's like even within the psi world, it seems like there's different positions, right? That people might really be just naturally skilled at.
Yes. Like I don't love so like yes, I'm a psychic medium, but I don't really dive into a lot of the stuff that some other psychics do. Like I'm not going to tell you about your love life. I'm not gonna shit, I can't tell you about my love life, much less yours. But I don't do a lot of like predictions or stuff. I admire the people that do, but I really stick to more so connecting to the departed or sticking where people are in their present circumstance and help them navigate it, right? So I think that's so validating for anybody that's listening. Is like we don't all have to do this the same. We can all do it differently, and that's amazing. Like
It
that's
is
so
amazing.
cool.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, one more comment on this, and then we'll get off this slide. But this is the juicy one. This is where all the, you know, a lot of the good stuff is. But so you also notice that there's an increase of fast brain waves in parts of the frontal lobe as well.
Mhm.
And so it's interesting because you have slow stuff, but you also have fast stuff. This is another really common pattern that I see is that kind of everything except alpha, which is in the middle, will ramp up, especially in the frontal lobes. And my theory there is that the slow stuff is helping you access information
Mhm.
and be more receptive and open. But then
Mhm.
you got to still use your frontal lobes in order to communicate that. Like
Yeah.
you still have to be present and alert and engaged and translate the information into a way that the other person can hear it.
Yep.
So that requires, you know, some frontal lobe activation, right? And almost sort of a normal way.
Yeah.
Like, you know, when you have a lot of info coming in, your brain still has to do its job.
Yeah.
So, you know, my theory is that that's why we see both of these things, right? It's like one of them is helping you be open and receptive, the other one's helping you communicate it
Yeah.
and translate it into, you know, something that the other person can resonate with.
I love that. I've always felt like I'm standing in two places at once, sometimes energetically speaking. So again, just like so validating to see.
Awesome. Okay. Um, this is just a highlight of that God spot, and it's only looking at the gamma, and there was a decrease of gamma. And
Mhm.
the only reason I put this up is just because the God spot is only on the right side, it's not on the left. And so if you look at the difference between the right and left, you can see very clearly that the right side's where all that blue showed up. Uh, and, you know, right there. And on the left, there's no corresponding, you know, it's not the same. So it's very clearly isolated to that right hemisphere, which is just kind of cool.
So cool.
Okay. So then the next part, I had to take a screenshot. So sorry, this isn't the most flattering picture, but
That
uh
that is my face I make so regularly. I'm like, what did you just say?
so the second part of the experiment that we did was you know, we took a break. We took a break, we went and had lunch, and then we came back, hooked you back up again,
Yep.
got another baseline. I don't think you were talking about White Lotus this time, or maybe you were, I don't remember. Um, but got another conversation baseline, hooked you back up, got ready for the second mediumship reading, but this time we added something extra. So we put these little pods on your head that are they were emitting a low power pulsed electromagnetic frequency.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what PEMF stands for, pulsed electromagnetic frequency. And we were doing this at 3 hertz. So it's a very slow frequency. And we specifically put the little pods, we put one of them in your left frontal lobe to try to quiet that down. And then we put the other two back at the God spot. Because the idea is that, well, if it's a slow brain wave, if it's a slow frequency, and your brain kind of gets on board with that, then it should quiet those regions down. And so it was kind of an experiment. We said, well, let's try this. Let's kind of zap your brain while you're doing a reading and see if that makes any difference. Um, and it did. I don't know if you want to comment on that now or you want to wait a minute.
Yeah, no, I will share because I think it might be nice to hear before they see it. When we did this, it reminded me of the very first time I ever did my first live in-person mediumship demonstration or gallery reading, where I felt like I had to kind of like get my bearings a little bit because it was almost like I was just hit with a lot of information at one time. And so it did feel different when I was giving the reading. There was a moment where I actually had to stop during the reading and like reground myself just for a second. And then I got back to it. And it was fine. And actually, the reading itself went well. It was just me just feeling like, okay, this definitely feels different. And that's the closest thing I could remind myself to. It was just not bad, not uncomfortable, just I'm receiving the information in a different way now. So I just need to reground and let it flow.
Yeah, and I hope you'll share later too that there may have been some after effects that we had discussed. But
Yes, I'll share that after the slide for sure. There were definitely some after effects.
okay, all right. So we did this recording, and the one thing that I wanted to look at was I just looked at the raw waves again. So you remember from the beginning when we talked about the raw signals, and what I did on this screenshot was I I just isolated 4 channels instead of looking at all 19 so that we can look at it more clearly. And the top 2 channels are looking at the left frontal area and the right frontal area. So the red and the green one. So the red one is on the left, the green one's on the right. And then with the orange and the blue, it's in the back of the head. So that God spot area, but it's left and right. And so I put the left ones on there so that you can see, well, I put, the opposite sides of the brain so you can see the difference. And so what was interesting is when I was looking at the raw signals, this would happen every once in a while. It didn't happen all the time, but where you would see these kind of abnormal spikes of activity. And they were happening in pretty much the same areas where we had those pods. And so, so to me, that's just confirmation that whatever we were doing was doing something, right? It was disrupting your normal signal in those areas, at least periodically. That kind of matches with what you were saying.
Yeah, totally.
And so then when we looked at the data the same way that we did the first time, it's interesting because there were some similarities, but there was also some significant differences. In fact, just to make life easy, I'm just going to go to this next slide because you can see them next to each other. So the first row is the first one that we already looked at. That should look very familiar.
Mhm.
And then the bottom one is what it looked like when we were doing the pulsed electromagnetic frequencies. Um, and so, a lot of it looks similar, right? Especially if you look at the fast brain waves and you look at the frontal lobes. It's like, well, okay, that looks about the same. But a lot of the rest looks pretty different. So there was much less of an increase of delta. It's much cleaner here, uh, except for this right frontal lobe again, right, which usually shows up. And look at your theta. Look how different this is. So instead of there being an increase of theta, like the first time, there was actually a decrease of theta. And then there was a decrease of alpha as well. And so it's not surprising that you had to kind of regroup because this is a pretty different brainwave pattern. And
Yeah.
in fact, even though we were trying to quiet your brain down, the overall pattern suggests that your brain was more active the second time.
My brain was like, I don't think so.
Right, you've got an oppositional brain. It did the opposite.
Honey, story of
Um,
my life.
the other thing, just real quick, is I know we're getting to the top of the hour, and I think we scheduled a little bit longer than that, didn't we?
We
Um,
did for quite, yeah, we scheduled about an hour and a half so we could take questions as well.
okay.
Yeah.
I'll try to wrap this. But the other thing that I think is interesting is if you look where this blue is in the back of the head with theta and alpha, it's kind of sitting on top of this network in the brain called the default mode network. And what's interesting is that one of the things that you see with psychedelics is you'll see this significant decrease of alpha in particular
Mm,
uh, in that area. And so again, it's another way that the brain kind of creates more flexibility and a more open awareness. So, if we think about what happens with psychedelics, right, is that people often have new perceptions and they have access to information that they didn't have before. Because again, you're kind of taking the filters off. Um, so what I think happened is that, and it makes sense with what you related, is that it's like, okay, wait a minute, this is different. I'm tapping in a different way here. So I think you still ended up in a place where you were bringing in information, but your brain did it a different way.
yeah.
So instead of what it normally does, it created this thing that looked a little bit more like a psychedelic effect, where it disrupted the default mode network. And, so you can still get info that way, but it's just different. Uh, and so I thought that was kind of cool, even though it wasn't really what we were expecting.
Yeah, and it was interesting because I definitely could still receive the information. It was just, okay, I need to receive this in a way that I wouldn't typically receive it.
Yeah. And did you want to say anything about the app? I'm gonna stop sharing these
So
slides if that's okay.
yeah, so afterward, it was really interesting. So during the reading, and I like to think I work pretty specifically with information that comes up, but the week after, I got more, I would say, bizarre, kind of like insanely specific information. Like the day after, I did a reading for a gentleman and his wife, and the gentleman's mother had departed, and the way that the information came through just felt a little different. Like it felt a little bit more clear. Like I didn't have to kind of like push as hard for it. And the mother showed me a slice of pickle on top of eggs on top of crackers. That is insanely specific. And I was like, your mom keeps telling me about this sandwich. It's got a pickle on it. It's got like egg. And he goes, oh my God, that's a sandwich my mom used to make us. And I just taught my sons how to make this sandwich. And I was like, I don't know what Dr. Tarrant did to my brain, but it was really cool to kind of have that experience of receiving information in a different way, but also more specific, which I like to give to my clients. But it was nice because it kind of made me like almost stretch in a way the way that I receive information and do it in a new way. Because I think sometimes as psychics and mediums, we can just get in our routine of how we receive. And I think, like a sports player, all these sports analogies, the more that you kind of stretch and try a new way, the stronger you kind of get. So I definitely really appreciated that for sure.
It's like cross training almost. Uh,
Yeah.
you know, uh, I mean, I appreciate that because, and I think I shared this with you, but a lot of psychic mediums that I've talked to, when I say, hey, do you want to try this technology or do you want to, and, a lot of them are kind of like, no, like they're afraid it's going to kind of mess up their flow, right? And so kind of like what you said, right? It's like, okay, wait, I've got a way to do that. I do things. I know how it works. I don't want to mess that up, which I can totally
Yeah.
respect. I get it. Um, but maybe there is some value, at least in some cases, to like, well, maybe, you bust it open a little bit and, try something a little different or see if it doesn't help, sort of connect with information in a different way or a different kind of information, maybe.
Yeah, and it was interesting because even the information that wasn't quite connecting in the reading, the person had messaged me almost immediately after and was like, "Oh my gosh, this was the birth date of the person that passed, and this was their name, and you were so right about that." And I was like, "Oh no, did these little electrodes screw me up?" But they didn't. They just I just received information in a different way, and so I had to adjust in real time. If you guys would like to start putting your questions in the Q&A chat, we'll start taking any questions that you have. So first question was, did any of this give me a headache? It did not give me a headache, and it wasn't like I couldn't the electrodes I couldn't feel. Like when he turned them on, I couldn't really feel them. I didn't know anything was even happening. Um, so it wasn't uncomfortable. It didn't hurt. And then we did have another question that I thought was interesting that came up in the Q&A that I wanted to ask you. Have you, and I know that we can't do this for me because we didn't test it, but have you, Dr. Tarrant, ever tested somebody just giving like advice versus a
Mhm.
reading? And did you see any differences in those scans?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and the answer is no. I've not personally done that. Um, there is a research study out there that was done by, gosh, I don't want to get it wrong, but I think it was Julie Beischel from Winbridge. I think they did a research study years ago looking at mediums, and they were looking at EEG as well. And they had each medium that they had them do a series of things where it's like remembering something and creating a story, a fake story about something. And, so they had them doing this series of different kinds of cognitive ways of getting information and then doing a reading. And they found that doing the mediumship reading was significantly different than just remembering or making up a story or whatever the other conditions were. So at least some researchers have started to look at that. But it's a very good question.
That's awesome. Lisa had asked just regarding the readings, do I still get specific info or was that just a byproduct of the experiment? And it went back to how I used to connect. So I still was getting specific information in my readings. This was just like that was like oddly specific. You know what I mean? So I haven't noticed. I still feel like I still give specific information. I still feel like there hasn't been much of a change there. It was like that couple of days though. I was like, okay, this is a little wild. Um, so Mary had asked, and I'm going to skip around the questions just a little bit, guys, but somebody had asked, has this work led you to help others improve or develop their psychic abilities, Dr. Tarrant?
Hmm. That sounds like a setup. The uh, so the short answer is yes. So we've been doing a fair number of classes and other kinds of experiments using different kinds of technologies. The technology we've been using the most is audio-visual entrainment that uses glasses that you put on. In fact, I've got some sitting here. They're very 80s sci-fi looking. Look at these. Oh
Those are
man,
cool.
aren't those attractive? But there's lights built onto the on the inside, and the lights flicker on and off at different frequencies. So you can essentially pull the brain, so audio visual entrainment. You can entrain your brain waves to specific frequencies. So for example, we could increase theta or we could increase gamma. And so we've been using that a lot in some of our psychic exploration classes, and it does seem to uh, do something. It does seem to have an effect and kind of ramp things up for people. The the thing that's interesting, and it kind of goes back to our earlier part of the conversation, is that everybody's different. And so if I give everybody the same program, half of the people love it and feel like it helps. Half of the people are kind of like, I don't know. And then we do a different program and it might be the exact opposite. The other half of the people love it and feel like it helps. The other half. So it's kind of like we have to do a little bit of an exploration to figure out what works best for each person. But back to the original question, yes, it looks like we can use some of these technologies to help kind of nudge the brain in the right direction.
Awesome. I have a few more questions I think are really
Yeah.
super beneficial to this conversation. Um, has there ever been a study on the same person years apart, like to show the brain adapting or to grow their skills?
It's another really, I need to be writing these down, right? These great research ideas. Uh,
Yeah. Oh, I'll send them
uh,
to you.
um, I'm not aware of that, but that's a really interesting idea. And in fact, I mean, in some cases, it's something that I could do, right, with some of the folks that I've worked with because, um, so for example, like Laura Lynn that we've talked about before, she was one of the first mediums that I measured, 10 or 11 years ago. And I still do things with her. So if I could convince her to put the cap on again, uh, it'd be interesting, right? Like 10 years later,
Yeah.
like does her brainwave pattern look the same as it did before, or does it look somewhat different? Um, So it's an interesting question, and one I think I'd like to follow up on.
Me too. Listen, you can count me in. We can set a date for April 1st for next year.
Yeah, yeah. Every
Um,
every year it'll be our annual thing.
I love that. I love that. Have you also done measurements of individuals during meditation? And if so, what are the similarities between brain activity while meditating versus giving a reading?
Yeah, I've actually done a lot of work with meditation. That's kind of how I got started with a lot of this stuff. And so it's interesting because generally with meditation, it depends on the type of meditation, first off, because there's a lot of different types of meditation.
Mhm.
But the kind of main thing that you see with meditation is a quieting of that default mode network, which
Mm.
I had mentioned right at the end.
And
That
that's the
place,
back of the brain, correct?
it's yeah, the hub of the default mode network is kind of right
Oh,
here,
right here.
right?
Okay.
And and that the default mode network, what its primary job is creating a sense of identity. So it's kind of like you thinking about yourself and how you relate to the world and what it means to be you. And so of course in meditation, a lot of for most types of meditation, you're trying to quit thinking about yourself and get yourself out of the way. And so that aspect is, does show up a fair amount in mediumship, but it doesn't show up all the time. And I think it's because mediums might have a different way to get to that same place, right? Like by quieting down the God spot or quieting down the frontal lobes. That I don't think it always has to be exactly the default mode network, but that's probably the biggest area of overlap.
Interesting. And then another great question that I'm honestly curious about as well. Have you ever studied a non-reader? So I think in this question we may maybe perhaps like a channeler
Hmm.
versus a medium to see if there's like what differences there might be in the brain and what the brain is doing.
Yeah, so I haven't looked at nearly as many channelers as I have, mediums, but I just last year had an opportunity to study this medium, or sorry, a channeler in Slovenia, and her name's Tjaša Dorle,
Mhm.
and she's amazing. She's really great, and her brain was really interesting because so when she's channeling, I mean, it's just wisdom pouring through her, right? And she's not aware of what the heck she's saying at the moment. But what's interesting is all of her brain waves just drop out to nothing.
Yeah,
So it's like all the heads are blue,
yeah,
right? When she's channeling. And so it's really interesting because that's her way of getting out of the way. Like she's just shutting the whole system down. Um, Even though she's talking, there's
yeah.
words coming out of her mouth, they make sense, but she's essentially kind of turned the brain off. So everything drops out. So now I've only seen that a couple of times. So it's a very unique pattern. But it does seem like maybe there are some differences, right, between channeling versus, uh, you know, a more kind of traditional way of doing mediumship readings.
Yeah, more maybe more active versus more passive. Because is
Yeah,
she the type of channeler that she's more passive, so she's perhaps like closing her eyes or not? Okay, that makes sense to me. Like, because I'm very active, meaning I'm
yeah,
present here having a conversation. Whereas there are people who would think like Bashar, who is more passive, where it's just the eyes closed and the words are coming out.
yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, that makes sense. And then got a couple other great questions in the chat. Um, do the scans show what part of the brain is working, in quotes, based on how the medium is receiving information, visual versus audio? Oh, so I understand that. Okay, so like if I'm hearing versus seeing, are you able to see any differences there?
Um, so I was smiling because I just answered that question yesterday in a different group.
As long as you
But
didn't answer it 5 minutes ago and I missed it, that's all I care
no,
about.
no, no. So it's a great question. So far, I have not been able to see anything that shows that specifically, and
Mhm.
I've got a few theories about that. And I think one of the reasons that maybe that's hard to see is because at least the mediums that I've worked with, most of them get information through several clairs.
Yeah.
It's not just it's not just visual. It's not just auditory, whatever. So they're actually getting information from lots of different types of sensory information, which is going to make it really hard to pull that apart. In fact, I'm not even sure I've seen anybody yet that says, no, I only see things or I only, um, so that, that's going to make it really tricky. The other thing that we didn't really get into much because it's a little bit different, but in psychic readings, it's very common for the very back of the head to light up, which is where the visual processing is. And that shows up a lot during psychic readings.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
so, but again, I don't know that it's specific to visual information, but that's where it shows up.
Interesting. Okay. Another great question. I'm familiar with Dr. Tarrant's work with the telepathy tapes, which is funny because when I heard you on there, I was like, hey, I've got a meeting with that guy. In your view, what's the difference between the children in those studies and mediums, especially considering that some nonverbal kids seem able to connect with the departed as well? Oh, that's an interesting question.
Yeah, so in some ways, I've only looked at been able to measure the brains of three of the kids in the telepathy tapes at this point. So I've got a limited data set.
Sure.
But it's interesting because there's a lot of overlap from what I saw and what I see with other mediums when they're kind of doing their thing. So the right frontal lobe, the God spot, right? These same areas seem to be involved, at least for some of them. Um, so that is very interesting. For me, I think one of the big differences and why they are so ridiculously accurate with their telepathy uh, is because of the lack of verbal language. I think that's the big difference. Is that one of the things that language does is it actually creates another limitation.
Mm,
As soon as we put words on something and try to describe it or analyze it, we've actually changed the nature of what it really is. We're not actually paying attention to what it is anymore. It's more of our interpretation of what it is, when we put words on something. And so the fact that they don't use verbal language, well, they do when they're spelling, but as far as communicating that way, I think that's the key. I think that's why they are so open to this information because they're not as limited by what we do with language and how we interpret things.
wow, that's really, really beautiful. I actually just had that conversation with my therapist. I was like, I love that I can intellectualize these things, but I wish that I could just be with the energy of these things. So many things mirroring my therapy session today. Okay, another interesting question. Where is the pineal gland, whatever, in Travis's brain, and how the brainwave and how is the brainwave activity around it?
Great question. Unfortunately, EEG is not very good at looking really deep into the brain.
Mm,
And so we can use some specific ways of analyzing data to get some ideas of what's going on below the surface, but we can't go that deep. And the pineal gland is like right in the center of the brain. And so we really can't see what's going on down there with EEG, unfortunately. So I don't know.
totally makes sense. And
Yeah.
then another question was, do you foresee mediumship ever becoming a standard career, meaning that there will be a time that people believe in it that much? I hope so. I mean, there's still people who are like unsure about therapists. So, and we've had therapy around for a long time. But there was a time though, and I like to share this to remind people, there was a time where like people thought therapy was nuts, like, and that it was not a legitimate thing, right? Like, so I hope so. I really hope so. What do you think, Dr. Tarrant?
I mean, I hope so too. Boy, I mean, it's hard to see that happening at the
Yeah.
moment, uh, just because, there's so many, people who are just not willing to really look at the evidence and accept the reality of what we're seeing here. And for me, that's been kind of the kicker, right? It's like I've seen enough things that at this point, I don't doubt it anymore because I've seen too much. But you have to be open to it. You have to be open to that this is a possibility. And there's just a lot of people that aren't. They are just not open, or they're
We,
scared of it. They think it's demonic or something, and so, I hope that's the case, but boy, it's hard to imagine.
yeah, man, I sure hope so too. Um, Dr. Tarrant, where can people find you? And tell you got an in-person event coming up in San Diego with
Mhm.
Laura Lynn Jackson, who's an amazing psychic medium. Where's that happening? When's that happening? Then how can people find you outside of this conversation?
Uh-huh. Yeah. So yeah, the event with Laura Lynn, I got to look it up real quick because I'm like, when is that? It's coming up very soon. It's in San Diego, and it is on uh, May 30th and May 31st. So the 30th, Laura Lynn's doing a gallery reading. That's on the night, Friday night. And then Saturday, we're teaching an all-day workshop together on that Saturday. So yeah, if anybody's in San Diego or can make it to San Diego in a couple of weeks, that'd be fun. Um, you can find out about what we're up to. Actually, I have two websites. The one that's most relevant for this conversation is psychicmindscience.com. And, it's got all of our upcoming classes and events and things like that. Psychicmindscience.com. Yeah.
Amazing. And you're also on Instagram,
On Instagram, Psychic Mind Science.
Psychic Mind Science. And then what will you be teaching at the live class with Laura Lynn Jackson?
Yeah, we've kind of got the day broken into little sections. And so the first section is telepathy. And so kind of what we do is, I do some of the research, brain stuff, and then, Laura, well, together, but we kind of guide people through various exercises to experiment and try some things, maybe do some meditations to get your brain on the right path, things like that. So we're doing uh, telepathy, some energy healing, psychokinesis, and then spirit communication.
I love that so much. And you've actually authored two books,
Mm-hmm.
and one of which you help people learn how to tap in to their own intuitive abilities, correct?
Yes.
Perfect. And
Yeah,
those are
that
on
one's
your
called
website.
yeah, that one's called Becoming Psychic. And
Yes.
yeah, you can get it pretty much wherever you get books.
So if anybody is interested, I'll also send out links. So everyone will receive an email with the link to replay this once we have it uploaded to the YouTubes. That'll get emailed out to everybody. And then in the email, I'll be sure to pop in where to find Dr. Tarrant and his work. Expect that email replay back within 24 hours. If you don't get it by this time tomorrow, you can DM me on Instagram, or you can shoot me an email at travis@travisholp.com, and I will make sure that you get the replay. But give me 24 hours first before you start hitting me up for the replay. Um, Dr. Tarrant, just thank you so much just for being here and for sharing. I can't speak for everyone, but I can say for me, this was just such a validating experience that I feel so grateful to have had the opportunity to spend time with you, because I think, we need people like you who live in the material science world to validate some of the things that we're experiencing and feeling, because then it just helps us go and serve with that much more confidence. I was rewatching The Matrix the other day, and something really clicked with me was that Neo, if you've never seen The Matrix, I'm sorry, you've had 26 years. I'm not going to spoil it for you. But Neo wasn't able to step into who he was until he believed he was Neo.
It's so
And if
funny that you bring this up. I was just thinking about this exact same scenario like 2 days ago.
Full chills, full chills. That's what I think when I watched it was like 2 or 3 days ago. I was on my plane home, but if you haven't seen The Matrix, go Google it, Google the synopsis. You'll understand the reference. I don't want to take up people's time talking about The Matrix, but I don't know. I think the work that you do, Dr. Tarrant, just solidifies the doubt I think it solidifies the belief that people have and helps to quiet the doubt and helps to reaffirm that what they're doing is completely normal, and that it's a beautiful ability that they have. So just thank you for the work that you do. I appreciate you.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate you and I appreciate the work you do. It's you're able to really help a lot of people heal in a way that I can't. And so, I appreciate your gifts and for, inviting me to be part of this and part of your world. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you to all of you who came, submitted your questions, who watched, and thanks to all of you who are watching the replay at home. And then also one more quick shout out. We have an amazing person here. Her name is Ari Honeyford. She runs an amazing spiritual community called Awkwardly Zen. Ari, if you wouldn't mind, pop the Awkwardly Zen website into the chat. If you're here with me or here with Dr. Tarrant and you aren't familiar with Awkwardly Zen, check out their community. They do so many amazing free events. So if you liked this, you'll love their community because they do a lot of free events. They also do some paid events, but they're just a great community that that help and serve a lot of people. So, Ari, thank you so much for coming. I'm just popping this into the chat. Um, and I appreciate you so much. Thank you, everyone, and thank you so much, Dr. Tarrant, again for being here. I love you. I'm incredibly proud of you, and we'll see you all very soon. Bye.
Thanks, guys.